Beautiful. Okay. So welcome to the 7 secret patterns Vue consultants don't want you to know. I am testing out a lot of these patterns, and part of it is I want to know a little bit more about the audience so I know how much detail I'm going to go into for some of these examples. So raise your hand way up high if you've been building Vue apps before, if you have prior experience building Vue apps. Raise your hand up high if you've heard of Vue, never used it. Quite a few people. Okay. I'm sorry to say for those of you who have never used Vue before, unfortunately some of this may be a little bit over your head, but I will try to, hopefully the previous talk answered some of those questions, and you'll be able to use a lot of these tips as soon as you start building Vue apps, and you'll be able to tell your Vue-using friends how you know more about Vue than they do, which will be a lot of fun. Okay. So, first I want to talk a little bit about me. That's me right there. This is at the first VueConf in Poland. That's me right next to Evan, who's actually wearing my shirt because he forgot his Vue shirt, amazingly. And I am the only person, as you can see, looking at the wrong camera. Eduardo is looking in a completely different direction. I don't know what he's looking at, but I think this is a lot about me. Everyone knew what camera to look at except for me somehow. I don't know how that happened. And I work on the Vue core docs. I work on a lot of tooling for developers in the Vue community, such as the migration helper. I've developed the parts of the ESLint plugin. And I also do a lot of consulting work, helping companies all around the world build, mostly these days, Vue applications, because when people contact me, it's usually because of Vue. And from this, I've taken a lot of experiences where I tell someone a trick, like something small that they can do in their Vue apps, and they think like, oh, wow, like I wish I knew this all along. I wish this had been more clear to me before. And sometimes it's not clear because we add new things to the docs all the time, and we're also constantly updating them to make them more clear and adding new resources. We're also developing a cookbook where we hope to reveal some of these patterns. And I also have a separate project where I've documented a lot of these patterns and other patterns that I don't have time to talk about today, but I will talk to you about the project later if you're interested. And I've divided these secrets into 3 general categories: productivity boosts, radical tweaks, and unlocked possibilities. Trying to stay with the clickbait theme. And I want you to know, even though there's going to be a lot of code here, you don't have to take notes. All of these slides will be available afterwards. I'm going to show you a link. And I'm also going to show you some code that's part of larger demos. And that code will also be available at that link that you can check out later. So productivity boost number 1, smarter watchers. How many people, raise your hand if you've used a pattern like this? And actually, for those of you who haven't used Vue before, you can raise your hand if you've used a pattern like this in another framework, where as soon as the component is created, you're doing something, for example, maybe fetching a user list from an API. And then also, whenever some kind of data changes, like search text, you're recalling that method to fetch new data from the API. For example, if that data, that search text, is attached to maybe an input, where as users type, you want to filter the users and then make a new search and show them a new list of users. Like if they search for John, show them the users that are called John. So raise your hand high if you've used a pattern like that in your app. So quite a few people, this kind of code looks familiar. So I'm going to show you a few optimizations that you can make to improve this code a little bit. And the first one is that watchers can actually take a string as a value instead of a function. And that string is just the name of the one method that you want to call whenever that happens. A lot of people don't know that. It's something that's easy to skip over in the docs. And there was once upon a time when we didn't document it as clearly, which has now been fixed. The other optimization I want to talk to you about is immediate true. So I'm going to rewind. So you see the value of search text, the search text watcher, is a string. Now it's an object, and the handler is either the function or the string that has the name of the method that we want to call. And immediate true means we don't need the created hook anymore, because the handler will be called as soon as the component is ready. It'll be called immediately. So this can not only make your code a little bit cleaner, but in case you decide to do a greater variety of things on created and also when that method is watched, by consolidating it all in the watcher, you can also reduce the surface area for bugs in your application. So that's the first tip, the first of 7. Productivity boost number 2. Component registration. So how many people have seen a pattern, something like this in your apps, where there are a lot of base components? I'm going to have you raise your hands in a second. Don't worry. I'm going to describe the pattern first, and then we're going to do raise hands. So you have a bunch of base components that sometimes maybe just wrap another element in order to apply some styles to them that are specific to your app. So you're importing base button, base icon, base input, and then you're registering all of them, all for sometimes less template code than there is JavaScript code just to make that possible. So now raise your hands. How many people have had to deal with something like that before? And it feels kind of frustrating, doesn't it? It feels like, why do I have to do all this work just to get this little bit of code? I'm using the button in every single component. Why do I have to import it always? I'm going to show you a solution. This will look like a lot of code at first, but I'm going to walk through it slowly. So the require context down, I know I was told to stay near the podium. Do you mind if I? Okay. I'm going to jump up right here. Require context. That's something specific to Webpack that you can use when you want to require a whole group of components programmatically. So here you can see we're requiring all of the components in the current directory that match the pattern base dash and end with .view. So all the .view components that start with base dash. And base is a common prefix that I like to use in applications for components that I'm using everywhere, and they often just wrap an element, and they often have the name of the element in the name, like base input, base button. And then we're going through all of the components that match that pattern. We're getting the component config, and then we're getting a Pascal case version of that component, and then we're registering it right there at the bottom with view.component. And this is a global registration. So that means it'll be available everywhere in your app. And in order to use this, you can drop this code just in your main.js or entry file for your application. But I often like to keep it in a component/_globals.js. And then in my main.js file or entry file, I'll import components/globals so that all of these global components are registered before my new view instance. And don't worry, you don't have to take pictures. There's going to be slides later. So you can if you want, I guess, if you want to live tweet it. But maybe this isn't the most exciting live tweet. And I want to talk to you about one more pattern here that you might be interested in. That's actually not really so much a Vue thing, but more of a Webpack thing that a lot of people don't know. So down here, we have component.default or component config. So how many people already know, oh yeah, I know why he's doing that? Raise your hands. It's one person, two people who are really into Webpack, maybe unhealthily into Webpack, like me. So if you, in your .view component, if you export default, that means your component options will be under component config.default. It'll be under the default option on the exported module. If you are importing, like if you import something from something else using the ES6 syntax, then that automatically will look for a default. When you're using require, though, it doesn't. So we have to specify that we want the default. Or if you've never export defaulted in your view component, like let's say you're using module.exports equals for the CommonJS syntax, then your component options will be under component config. Also, if you just have like a template and maybe some styles, and you don't even have a script tag, then your component config will also be under component config instead of .default. It's a little Webpack thing that can trip people up a lot of times. They're not sure, like, why is it doing it? Why is it a default sometimes, and why is it not a default sometimes? And I have been one of those people. And now I know, and I want you to not be frustrated with that too. Okay. So now, using that pattern, we can take all this JavaScript that was needed to support this pretty simple template and get rid of it. We never need it. We only have to import components when we actually need them. Now, you may be wondering, like, wow, this seems like, why don't we just, like, import everything globally, like register all components globally? And you could do that. But I wouldn't recommend it for this reason. For more niche components, like let's say you have a nav bar in your application, and you decide to stop using that nav bar. Or maybe you're not using that nav bar for all users. Or with Webpack, you want to split it out into a separate module so that it's only fetched from your server when you actually need it to reduce the size of bundles. If you decide to do something like that, but you're registering all of your components globally, then all of your components are guaranteed to be in your bundle, even if they're not being used, and even if you have specified that you'd like to split them out into a separate bundle. So your bundles can get really big, and it can get difficult to maintain over time. But your base components are being used everywhere. Productivity boost number 3. Module registration. So this is a little bit similar to the previous one. And I want to get a quick hands for people who have used Vuex before. Okay, and keep your hands up if you've used Vuex modules. Okay. So Vuex modules are little pieces, for those who don't know, little pieces of state management that you can bring into your application. So like, let's say you might have an auth module to handle authentication in your app and keep track of like whether a user is signed in and things like that. You might have a post module to keep track of all the posts that you're keeping track of in your application that maybe you fetched from the server and are displaying to the user. Same thing for comments for those posts. So these are just discrete pieces of application state. And this pattern isn't unique to Vuex. If you're using some other kind of library like Redux with Vue, or if you're using a completely different framework but are using Webpack, you can still use a pattern like this in your apps. So whenever you create a new module, whenever you have a new kind of thing that you want to keep track of the state for, like let's say we also have, post stars, or maybe users can star all sorts of things. So we're keeping track of all the things that users have starred in the application. We might have a separate module for that, and when we add that module, we'll have to add import stars from module stars, and then also add stars to the modules here. It's a little bit more setup that you have to do every time, and eventually your store file here can get really big and busy. It's tedious. But there's a solution. This might look familiar from what we previously just did with component registration. So we are requiring all the different modules. I usually keep this in an index.js file inside of modules, by the way. All of the JS files inside of the current folder. And then we're going through each of those files. And if the file name is index.js, basically if the index.js file is looking at itself, just like bail. Don't do anything with it. Because it's the one thing in that folder that won't be a module. And then we're getting the module name by camel casing the file name. And then we're adding it to a modules hash, or modules object. Sorry, I was giving a Ruby talk earlier, not exactly a talk, but sort of a consultant thing. And then we're requiring the module by its file name. And then we export all those modules. And there's one other optimization that I want to show you that I often like to do here. If you like namespaced modules, or if you want to set some other kind of default option for all of your modules, you can do that here by setting like namespace to true, which is false by default for Vuex modules, and then add in the rest of the module options there. That's really great for managing. It's really great for managing like best practices in your apps. Like if you've decided on your team, like we want all of our modules to be namespaced unless there's a very good reason for them not to be namespaced. That's a great way to code it in so that no one can accidentally leave that out. Like they have to explicitly say namespaced false. So now our modules, or our store file is much simpler. We can just import modules from modules and then export default new Vuex store modules. Much better. So those were all the productivity boosts. Now I'm going to tell you about some radical tweaks. Radical tweak number 1. So these are tweaks that are like tiny changes that have a big impact. Cleaner views. So how many people, again, I want to get a sense for how many people have used View Router? Okay. For those who haven't used View Router, it's a companion library for Vue that helps you manage helps you manage applications with multiple pages. So let's say you have, / which is just like your home page, and then / about. As soon as you need that / about, if you're using a quote-unquote single-page application, which is like what everybody in the industry calls it, but it's kind of a bad name because usually single-page applications have more than one page. It's just like one HTML file. So this helps you have more than one page despite that one HTML file that you're serving to all your clients. So this is a lot of setup where in our data, we're setting some defaults, and then every time the route changes, notice we're watching it with our old watcher trick, our smarter watcher trick. So this is a combo trick. We have to reset the data to its initial value just in case the previous route was using the same component as this route. So let's say, for example, you're going from /posts /1 being just like the ID of the post. And then you're going from that route to /posts /2. What Vue will do is it'll see like, okay, both of these routes use the same component. So instead of starting it up from scratch, I'm going to be a little bit smart and render the minimal possible, make the minimal possible changes. And I'm not even going to start like a new post component. I'm just going to give it different data, which can lead to some edge cases, which we have to deal with this code. And sometimes it'd really be nice if you could simplify to something like this. So as you can see, we've gotten rid of all of our reset data. We've gotten rid of our watcher. Now we're just getting the post uncreated, and we have our get post method still. And we have our data that we only have to initialize once, which is kind of ideal. The way to do that is with one line, by adding a key to router view. And specifically, a key I often like to add is route.fullPath. And that just tells Vue that if the full path changes, even if the component is the same, you should render it from scratch. So what that means is you might have, or you will have, slightly worse performance from route to route, but your Vue components or route components will be a lot simpler and probably less likely to have bugs in them. I've seen a lot of people get frustrated from oh yeah, I guess we can have multiple posts, and then they never test that until they actually go from one post to another. They actually add a link from a post page to a next post, and then they're wondering what's going on? It's still showing the old post. And they get really frustrated. And this just makes all of your routes a little bit more predictable. And they behave a little bit more like views that you're used to in a lot of other backend frameworks, especially if you're coming from a backend. So I think it's more than worth the sacrifice of slightly slower performance on route changes for most applications. Radical tweak number 2. Transparent wrappers. So we were looking at some base input, base button components before. Here's what the template for our base input might look like. It just has an input, and then we're assigning the value as the value being passed down as a prop. And then every time there's an input, for those who aren't familiar, we were looking at VON earlier in the first talk. At is an alias for VON, and the colon is an alias for vbind. So whenever there's an input event, basically whenever user types something in, it emits the input event to the parent so that this can work with vmodel, which we also saw earlier in the first talk. And then you might also have some styles here too. And then when you're using this component, it's very common that you might want to listen for some other kind of event that you haven't explicitly specified in your component. So let's say every time the component gains focus, you want to do something. And you have to add this .native modifier, because otherwise this will listen, the @focus will listen for a focus event emitted from the component, similar to what we're doing with input here. And the .native says, no, we want to listen to an event that's on the root element of the component. And the root element of this component happens to be input. There's a problem. What happens when we add this? What happens when we refactor our base input component a little bit? Now it's wrapped in a label. And now the root element of that component is a label. So our focus.native listens for a focus event on the label instead of the input. And so then you're focusing on the input and wondering why isn't this working anymore? I just wanted to listen for a focus event on the input. It's a base input event. And this is my solution. I like to create a listener's computed property that returns an object with all the properties from listeners. This .listener stores all of the listeners from the parent component, and then we'll override input so that, again, it still works with vmodel. And then we're going to use the von object syntax. You can use von without any kind of event specified, pass it an object, and it will listen for all of the listeners specified in that object. Which means for our base input, we no longer have to do focus.native. We can basically treat it as an actual input component and just use focus. On focus, do something. And it'll just work. And it's future-proof. When we're using this base input component, we no longer have to know about, like, oh, how is it structured internally? Like, what's the root element? This will just always work. So I usually recommend building base components like this from the start. But we're not quite done yet. There's an additional problem. What happens when we add this placeholder here? It'll add a placeholder to the label, because by default, Vue passes any anonymous attributes, any attributes not specified as a prop, to the root element of the component, in this case the label. And a placeholder on a label, I actually haven't tried it, but I would assume it does nothing. I would assume it would just make my app not work. When really I want to pass anything here directly to the input, because I want to act like I'm just interacting with an input. And there's an option here too that's relatively new to Vue. If you learned Vue a while ago and you haven't completely reread the docs like every week since then, you might have missed out on some things. Inherit attrs false. This is an option that you can add to your Vue component config that tells Vue that you don't want this component to just automatically inherit attributes to the root element of the component. Instead, we're going to explicitly define how these attributes are handled with vbind attrs. Vbind also takes an object syntax, and attrs is an object that contains all of the attributes that aren't defined as props in this component, but passed to it right here. And I've seen a lot of UI component libraries where before this was available, or maybe they didn't know this was available, they just had a huge, huge component file for like every possible attribute that you could add, including like custom like data attributes from some third-party plugin that they want to use with Vue. Like, if they want to use like some like jQuery date picker or something like that, and it requires like, data.datepick or something like that. And so this component can sometimes become like hundreds of lines long, just with these huge lists of attributes that we want to make sure are passed to this input component. And this gets rid of all of that. You never have to worry about whether the attribute will be handled correctly. So now we really have fully transparent wrapper components. This is actually like one of my favorite tips. Once I was able to do this, like I think there might have been a tear. There might have been a small tear. So we've gone through the productivity boost. We've gone through the radical tweaks. Now we're on to unlocked possibilities. So these are things that you might not even have known you could do with Vue. Number one, single root components. So here's an error that I've seen a lot, where Vue tells me, oh, you need exactly one root element. How many people have seen this before? Raise your hand up high. Yeah. I know this. I wrote the doc that warns people about this. And it still happens to me sometimes. Like, oh yeah, and then I'll wrap it in a div. And then I'll make Vue happy. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work. Sometimes you want a pattern that really requires returning more than one component. Like in this hypothetical, actually not that hypothetical because this is an actual component I built, navbar component that renders, some persistent nav routes. These are some, navigation routes that are always there. There are some routes I only want to show if you're logged in, and some routes I only want to show if you're logged out. There probably aren't a lot of applications that have like sign in and sign out that don't require like something like this, right? This is a pretty common use case. But there's a problem here. This component, this navbar component, has a single root element, the UL, but our navbar routes might be problematic. Because when we try to do something like this, it looks like, oh yeah, we only have one root element, like li. We only have one li. It's just repeated with v4 a bunch of times. So we're trying to return an array of elements, and Vue's not going to be very happy with us. We've actually created an error here. How many people have run into that? Yeah, me too. Me too. I still dream sometimes. Well, there's a solution. A lot of people don't know this, but functional components that use a render function can actually return an array of elements. So here, we're rendering over, or we're mapping over all of our routes, and then we're returning an li with a router link, which is a Vue router specific component. And that will actually work. Multi-root components! I was really, really happy when I was able to do this too. It opened up like a whole new arena for patterns. The only downside that I found is if you are using components like this, like all over your app, that means all the developers on your team probably have to know how to write render functions, which is maybe not something you might want if you have a lot of juniors on the team, or if you have just a really big team with a lot of diverse skills. So in those cases, it might be worth trying to refactor to use something that's not quite as nice of a pattern, but still allows you to have one root at each component. I'm curious about this. How many people... I don't want to include the people who haven't used Vue yet because you probably didn't know about this trick. But for the people who have used Vue, raise your hand if you didn't know about this trick. That render functions could actually return multiple roots. Okay, so quite a few. I'll be asking at the end to see how many people didn't learn anything, and I will find you and I will teach you something. Unlocked possibility number 2. Rendering non-HTML. So this is a little map that I built with a library called MatteboxGL, which is a really, really cool mapping library that I highly recommend. These are all the different cities that I've lived. As you might see, you can zoom in, zoom out. You can hover over cities and get a little tooltip. There's also a little navigation down here. And MatteboxGL, as you might have guessed from the name, doesn't render HTML, but it actually renders WebGL. And that's how we get these like really nice, slick, performant maps. And WebGL code, or MatteboxGL code, tends to look like this. You know, you have a map, unload, you add a source, add layers, add events. Now, the only issue is this isn't really like the declarative Vue code that you may have grown to love. This is, you know, we're back to just declarative code. And I've seen integrations like this where you basically just have a component that's like, oh yeah, on created, just do all this stuff. And it renders the whole map. And that component isn't really reusable because if you want to have a different map that's like slightly different, then it's still like one big file. And what do? Do you like copy that over and then just like change the one thing? Like, oh, we want to like different colors. We really want an API. It's more like this. Like we want to feel like we're using HTML. So maybe a Mattbox map, and inside of the map, we can have Mattbox markers for all those little like pins that we had in the map. And I'm defining a template here for what shows up when you hover over that map. And here, MatteboxGL actually allows us to use some HTML. So we can pass it some HTML in this template. And then we have a Mattbox navigation component to make the navigation show up. And the way that I like to do that is usually with, this is the only time, like in this kind of situation is the only time that I'll say, yeah, it might be okay to use this stop parent. Everywhere else in the docs and everywhere else in real life, I'll tell you, no, please don't use this stop parent. Like it's for, very specific situations. And this is one of those very specific situations where inside of our Mattbox marker components and Mattbox navigation components, it might actually be okay to reach into the parent and get the map, because those are very tightly coupled components. You're probably not going to have a Mattbox marker component that's not inside of a map. And if you want a little bit of a different strategy, so if you have deeply nested components inside of the Mattbox, like if it's really complicated, you might want to look into the provide inject interface, which is also relatively new if you've been using Vue for a while. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but you can check it out in the docs. Just put that away, provide inject, or you can. That's the one case where you can write a little note, because that won't be anywhere. And then on created, we do some initialization. Before destroy, we do some cleanup. And you can also, with some watchers, update your data source when the markers that are passed to maybe this Mattbox markers components, or the items that are passed, that's what the prop is called, passed to the Mattbox markers components changes, then you can watch that. And then instead of a template, we have a render function that just returns null. You can actually do that. You can return null, and it'll just like, okay, I won't render anything. I'll trust you. You got this. So these are really more abstract components that allow us to take this imperative code, these like lists of instructions, and sort of morph it into a more declarative interface that is reusable across your app. And I want to pay special attention to the template slot scope city here. So you can actually pass, if you haven't used scope slots before, you can pass a template to a child that uses data that only the child has. So for each city, the child is going to pass this part of the template, the city, and then we're going to render the city name in an H3. And I want to show you how we're actually doing that in MatteboxGL. So here we have our scope slot, and we're passing markered up properties to it. This creates some vnodes, virtual nodes. These are like blueprints for HTML. And then we're creating a new Vue instance to render the pop-up content nodes, get the inner HTML, and then set that pop-up HTML. So now we've turned Vue into sort of like a generic template system, sort of like Pug or handlebars or something like that, EJS, embedded JavaScript in HTML files, where you can pass it some data and use it outside of the DOM that Vue is controlling. If you can't get enough, that was my last tip. If you can't get enough, I recommend checking out github.com/crispyfritz/Vue Enterprise Boilerplate. This is a recently released project that has a lot of these patterns in it, with like described in detail in the source code, including more examples for like how to handle authentication in apps and all sorts of things. I highly, highly recommend it. And I also have an announcement just today. This is the first time I'm announcing it. I just started the Patreon. Small plug, I apologize. Patreon.com/ChrisViewFritz. I just started this today. You're the first people in the world who know about it. Because right now I use like 20% Vue time, and I have 80% consulting time, and I want to flip it so I can make your lives even easier, write more docs, more tooling, stuff like that. And that's it. That's the end of the plug. Now we can do some questions for just like a couple minutes. We might have time for one question. You can find these slides and other source code at 7 Secret Patterns. I'm at Crispy Fritz everywhere. GitHub, Twitter. I think that's it, actually. But if I do join another network, that's who I'll be. Repeat question for audience.
If they ask one.
What does it mean again? Repeat question for audience?
If somebody asks a question, then you repeat that question.
Oh, got it. Yeah. I know that deal. Okay, cool. Cool. Any questions? Yes, that's right here. Yeah, you'll find a link to it. Yeah, you'll find a link to it. Yeah. Sorry, the question was, do you have the Mattbox? Thank you. I know, seriously. She just told me, and then we clarified it. Okay, yeah, so thank you. Can you find the Mattbox project? Yes, you can. If you follow that link, it's in the README. There'll be a link to it in the README. And it's not actually like open source. It's sort of just like a little demo because I took it out of another app, and it's not really built for consumption for like other people yet. But you can do that if you want to, and you have more time than me. Go ahead.
What's the number one most avoidable mistake that you see people making in a lot of your consulting?
Gosh, number one most avoidable mistake. Well, I'd say if so many people are making it, it's obviously not the most avoidable. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question.
What's the most common repeated mistake?
Gosh, I do see a lot of people reach for like this.parent or interact with the DOM manually. When they're not used to, having Vue mostly handle that stuff for them. Yeah, it's hard to say. Depending on their past experience, you'll get a lot of different kinds of mistakes. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
What would you say is like the most common anti-pattern tool for Vue app that's scaled to a larger size?
Most common anti-pattern that I've seen. Let's see. Gosh. There are some that I'm torn because there are some that I really don't like, and there are some that I've seen more. And fortunately, I think we've done a good enough job on documentation that the ones I really don't like, I tend not to see very often. But I don't see this very often anymore because I've like plastered notices about it everywhere. But when people are using something like an event bus instead of Vuex or some kind of more robust state management solution, that can be frustrating. I have 0 minutes left. So if you have another question.
You can do one more.
Oh, I can do one more. Whew. All right. Go ahead.
Do you find yourself splitting computer properties into getting and setting a lot?
Do I find myself splitting up computed properties into getting and setting a lot? No. I find myself doing it sometimes, but not frequently. Yeah. But some other people, like Guillaume from the Vue core team, he uses it more than me, and I think the way that he uses it is cool and good. It's just there are often equally good patterns that you could reach for, and that's one that I reach for a little bit, I don't know, average. Okay, and I think that was the last question that I had time for. But I will be here all day, so you're free to ask me a question during a break or just tell me about what you're building, stuff like that. Love to hear from you. Ciao.